Well, great. Thanks, everybody. Hello, my name is Mark Huffman. I'm the director of the Center for Global Cardiovascular Health and the Quentin Young Professor of Health Policy. And I'm honored to introduce Dr. Victor Dzau. He's the president of the National Academy of Medicine and vice chair of the U.S. National Research Council. Dr. Dzau is Chancellor Emeritus of Duke University. Previously, he was chair of medicine at Harvard, as well as Stanford universities. Dr. Dzau is highly regarded as a trailblazer in translational research, health innovation, and global health. His seminal work laid the foundation for development of life-saving drugs known as ACE inhibitors, which we use all the time and all around the world to treat hypertension and heart failure. He's pioneered gene therapy for vascular disease. As one of the world's preeminent health leaders, he has served as chair of the NIH Cardiovascular Disease Advisory Committee and now chairs the NIH Cardiovascular Stem Cell Consortium. Currently, he's a member of the Health Biomedical Sciences Advisory Council of Singapore and was on the board of health governors of the World Economic Forum and chairs its Council on Human Longevity and Enhancement. Dr. Dzau is active in global health, which is obviously a big passion for all of us here today. He serves on the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, steering group of the Global Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, and was on the interim board of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. He's the perfect speaker for today. Leading the National Academy of Medicine, Dr. Dzau has launched important initiatives such as the Global Health Risk Framework in 2016, the Global Health and the Future Role of the US in 2017, Crossing the Global Quality Chasm in 2018, Human Gene Editing, and the National Academy of Medicine Grand Challenge in Healthy Longevity. There'll be a time for a short Q&A following Dr. Dzau's presentation led by Dr. Murphy. We welcome you to submit any questions through the chat feature. Dr. Dzau, we are delighted to have you. Thank you very much for being here today. Over to you. Victor, you're on mute.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Rob. Thank you for inviting me. Northwestern is one of my favorite schools, and I'm so delighted to be able to speak to all of you on global health. Lisa did a really good job and make my task difficult, but I would say to Lisa, considering all those challenges ahead of us, you must work very hard to advise the state of Illinois and city of Chicago how to tackle these issues, because I think all of us in US and globally are tackling that exact issue of how to get equity, particularly in the distribution of vaccine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the following. One is COVID and the lessons learned. What have we learned from COVID? And pivoting to the importance of a global solidarity, multilateralism, and getting vaccines, diagnostic therapeutics available. And importantly, I'm going to talk about vaccines and look at the current situation of vaccines in US and globally, and particularly getting into the issue of allocation and distribution. So if I may I have the next slide, please. So as Mark said, in 2016, the National Academy of Medicine put out a report called A Neglected Dimension of Global Health Security. We actually, maybe one of the first times, mentioned or stated that this is much more than health. This is not only health, but also economy and security. At a time when Peter Sands, who's now the head of Global Fund, chaired this group, our statement was, by analysis, we're looking at somewhere between $10 to $50 billion of economic impact. Well, we know with COVID, that's hardly scratching the surface. From Ebola, the United Nations Secretary General High-Level Commission came out with recommendation that there should be an independent monitoring board for global preparedness for pandemic and epidemics, hence GPMB. And I've been very honored to be serving on it along with Tony Fauci and many other distinguished individuals. To make a long story short, in 2019, where we're still seeing some Ebola in Africa and elsewhere, we wrote a report to say the world is at risk. And in that report, we say not only we're not prepared for health emergencies, but we said we warned the real threat of a rapidly spreading pandemic due to respiratory virus that can be lethal. And guess what? It was probably no more than prescient that we actually made that point, because we said, look, there's 7 urgent actions to be taken. They listed here. And sadly, I can tell you that not a lot were taken up at that time. And next slide. Of course, we're now confronted with COVID-19. You know, the number keeps evolving. And, you know, I keep on having to update the slide. But as you can see, just yesterday or day before, we're dealing with 1.5 million deaths and 65 million cases across the globe. US, well, I'm sorry to say we're leading the pack. Not something to be proud of. 14 million cases, more than India, and 280,000 deaths. And as you can see, the world is simply not prepared because this is devastating in so many different ways. Next slide. And when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, healthcare, education, climate investment, poverty, it has devastating impact on every one of them. 90% of healthcare systems are disrupted. Not only does it have to respond to COVID, but, you know, childhood vaccination, usual primary care, all disrupted. In April, the number I can find is 1.6 billion kids out of school. And of course, it's much larger. This morning, my granddaughter was here, and I helped her set up her iPad to do a virtual conference learning. But imagine those who don't have access to it. And imagine the global issues of this is substantial. Many people say we're losing years of education in this in our children. There's been a substantial reduction in investment in clean energy. And of course, more than 135 million people are pushed into poverty. All you have to do is see on television, the lines for food, you know, supply, you name it. It is really devastating. So this is more than health. This is about all of society. Next slide. So what are the lessons learned? First, we learned this is a collective failure. Collective meaning everybody in the globe to take this pandemic prevention preparedness response seriously and prioritize it. Certainly, I mentioned about our reports didn't make that much difference. We also learned, of course, we live in an interconnected world where shock anywhere can become catastrophe everywhere. And I think the important lesson to learn is the human dimensions. I'll come back to that. Leadership and citizenship matters. How we respond to an outbreak and how do we actually stay on top of it requires true leadership and everybody playing a role. I already said there's well beyond health. It's about everything in our society. One of the interesting things that we spent so much time before COVID is to say, are we measuring how we prepared? And the National Health Security Index by Johns Hopkins, US is ranked #1 in preparedness. Well, I need not to tell you how we are in response. So these measurements are not quite, in fact, predictive. They are useful, but it's what we do with our preparedness and response that's the most important issue. I think at the end of the day, we need effective agile systems. We need to understand this is a common good, and therefore we need to invest. Return investment is immense. And really, no one is safe until all are safe. It's not simply the sum of national preparedness. It's much greater than the sum of all of this. And we already now live in a very complex world, and it needs solidarity and not a fragmentation. Next slide. This slide should give you a headache. It's worse than a metabolic slide. You know, when you look at all the pathways, you say, how do you put that together? Well, we did in our report look at the architecture of preparedness before COVID-19. I need not to say more that we clearly need much better architecture and governance globally, including US. Next slide. But perhaps the most important thing I want to talk about for the next 5-10 minutes is what our report in the middle of COVID, what our report said. It's a world in disorder. We call for actions, urgent one, to respond to COVID-19 and better prepare the world. This report came out in September. Of course, we're writing it throughout the time of COVID. There are 5 findings: responsible leadership, engaged citizenship, strong agile systems, robust global governance, and sustained investment. Next slide. So let me talk about leadership. Well, we are seeing in our country the issue in play. What we need as we call for urgent action is that every country, national leaders, and international organizations must take early, decisive action. That early action must be based on science and evidence. And that we discourage the politicization of measures of public health, social protection, etc. Well, I need not to say more what we have lived through for the last 10 months in our country. But if you look at countries that has done well, such as South Korea, Singapore, and many other countries, what they have done is early decisive action in doing proper containment, protection based on science. And those who come in later, as some of our countries, including ours and UK, etc., have not done well. What we're also missing in the next bullet is a high-level coordinator who looks across all the sectors. So it's not pivoting between economy versus health, health versus economy, they're the same thing. You need a whole of government approach, whole of society approach. And third, as Lisa talked about, when we have those vaccines and measures, diagnostic, therapeutics, we need to be allocated in an equitable fashion. We need a national strategy, and that's what we really need. Next slide. Citizenship, it also matters. Again, I'm seeing it play out in our own country. Citizens must demand from government accountability, and they need to strengthen civil society and empower their citizenship. And every one of us must take responsibility to not only educate ourselves, our family, protect them, and protect each other. If citizens don't think about the public good to work together, protect each other, then we're going to find out, in fact, what we face with today. So human dimension has not been sufficiently emphasized, but I think we see this play out and we know how important it is. Next slide. Third, of course, is a national and global system for global health security. We think about what heads of government must do. It must strengthen national systems, all of society approach, and not health here, economy here, you name it. The One Health approach integrates animal and human health, but also we have to establish core public health capacity workforce for surveillance, detection, you name it, and not to make it up when we have to do it. We need to be able to deal with surge capacity, and importantly, looking at what we are dealing with today, social protection. In countries that understand that each citizen must be protected, and in this case, like Germany, where they actually working with the private sector so that the citizens don't lose any jobs, subsidized by government, versus allowing the economy to float, and then you put in stimulus bills later, I think you're not giving social protection. I think there's so many lessons we can learn. We can write a book just in our own country. But also research is really important. It's part of, agile system to be able to look at coordination and support for research, vaccine, diagnostic therapeutics, and NPIs. And of course, we need to commit to everybody working together in a multilateral way. And at the end of the day, WHO is the best we have, not perfect, but we need to support it. Next slide. So when it comes to governance of emergencies, you can see that there are things that needs to be done. That is the international health regulation, which is in fact volunteer reporting of compliance and preparedness, need to be much tighter and accountable. And there's a lot of discussion right now how to reform this. We need to bring together multi-sectors to be prepared and not just simply in health. And of course, we are asking to have a summit to look at an international framework to reduce that complexity you saw in the slide I showed you. Next slide. And the final one that leads to the discussion, the main discussion today, is investment. Every country has to invest and understand how important health investment is. It's not a burden. is not one to treat disease, is one to prevent disease, but also prepares emergency. But the global leaders have to come together also to make sure there's adequate support finance. So for poor countries and not so poor countries. And the third bullet is the key for today's discussion. When we look at financing of vaccines, diagnostic therapeutics, well, US has active and warp speed. We have spent $11 billion, but not the rest of the world. So how do you actually get enough resources to get those things from research all the way to distribution? I'll talk about that. So it is a common, global common good, and should not be at the mercy of political economic cycles. And then the multilateral bank and finance institutions have to change to be able to move more faster and support global public good. Next slide. So that leads me to talk about how we're responding to the pandemic. Well, you can see here transmission. If you're mild disease asymptomatic, it can be treated outpatient. First of all, of course, it starts with testing. We need a national strategy. And then, of course, when you have mild disease, you can be treated, and therapeutics are important. Remdesivir is a little complicated, as you all know. We're not so sure it's that effective, but we haven't really tested mild to severe disease. Monoclonal antibodies, which has just been authorized under emergency use authorization, is to be given outpatient to mild disease. That itself is a big issue about allocation, distribution, equity. But if you could shift to the middle column, you see severe disease. Obviously, we're all living through this. Hospital ICU bed capacity, frontline workers, you name it. And then the health system, PPE, oxygen, you name it. So at the end of the day, in the upper right column, you can see vaccine is going to be a critically important issue to stop this pandemic. And to the left side, access and location, as Lisa said, becomes critical. Next slide. So NPIs, public health measures, interventions are critically important. But as you can see in the left-hand column, it peaked, and now we're at a plateau. That's simply not enough because right-hand column shows the case is still going up. So we are really very much dependent on vaccines, treatment, and other countermeasures. Next slide. So I want to tell you globally first. This is a global health lecture about what's going on globally, and then come to US in the later part. At the end of the day, really what happened triggered a number of important events which got to us where we are today, which is much better than when we started. So GPMB, Jeremy Farrar and I led the charge to say, let's call out for $8 billion after we did a high-end evaluation, what's needed for vaccine, drugs, and diagnostic. This was responded by a global pledge led by European Commission. And then following shortly after that is the activation of the COVID-2's accelerator called ACT Accelerator. Next slide. So Ursula von der Leyen, a physician, the president of the European Commission, and also a personal friend, was willing to respond to our call to organize this pledge on May 4th. This involved many global health and heads of state leaders. And over a period of, I think about 6 weeks, we raised 18 billion, over 8 billion. This was great. And I'll come back to tell you it's not enough. Next slide. Then almost concurrently with WHO, European Commission, heads of state, particularly France and others, they came together, created this ACT Accelerator with the idea that we need to combine together with everyone because there are lots of countries who don't have capability. Next slide. So the formation of the global response to COVID, ACT Accelerator, looks something like this. The important issue is to look at the 3 columns and a cross-cutting sector. 1 column on vaccine, 1 therapeutics, and 1 diagnostic. Looking at end-to-end from R&D, what kind of research we need to support, How do you enable clinical trials of those promising ones? How do you actually begin to start manufacturing even before we know it works so that it's ready when we need it? How do you buy and procure, purchase, and how to deploy? So you can see that they all prepare to bring together. What's unique about this is overseen by a coordination hub and principals, which I serve on. And then it's overseen by council of G20 and other partners and foundations, such as Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and others. And the cross-cutting is to say, how do we shore up the health system for PPE, oxygen, you name it. Now, the important thing to point out, shown next slide, is the uniqueness of bringing together sectors and entities who are actually in separate silos. You know about Gavi. Gavi is the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization, where they in fact help to procure vaccines for poor countries. CEPI is an entity that was founded some years ago, about 5-6 years ago, which I participated in and serve on the board, which is supposed to look at what platforms of vaccine do we invest in, how do we enable clinical trials, and how do we enable it to be translated. And of course, WHO, you know well, Global Fund in looking at treatment for and prevention of HIV, TB, malaria, and World Bank and others. But this is the first time that these entities come together to work end to end, to say we're going to work together so we do not multiple handoffs, but we can prepare the whole transition. Next slide. So in vaccine, the goal is to get 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. In therapeutics, 245 million courses of treatment by mid-2021, and diagnostic 500 million tests by 2021, and of course, health system supplying enough oxygen PPE globally. Well, it's worked very hard. It was founded, remember, back in about April or May. Next slide. And this slide needs to be updated already, but you can see 10 vaccine candidates selected by the vaccine pillar through CEPI, moving along clinical trials. And you can see there about 200 candidates being followed. And of course, in many ways, we're working along with Gavi and WHO to look at purchasing, et cetera. I'll come back to that. Therapeutics, 1,700 clinical trials followed, 200 actionable readouts, and 15 country clinical trials. And of course, dexamethasone came out from this work. Diagnostics, now there are point of care rapid diagnostic tests which are being moved along and undergoing emergency authorization. And so we're certainly moving along as well as health system. Next slide. So I think Accelerator is unprecedented because when you have Gavi, CEPI, Global Fund, WHO are working separately at different stages, for the first time people come together and work under one roof to try to move end to end, including think about how to move manufacturing, get to work with companies, get them to start willing to take greater risk by actually getting the kind of procurement agreement so that they know they're funded for their risk. They also know that the doses will be purchased. But as I said, it's a great concept, it's moving really well. Next slide. But we still have a big gap. We started looking at how much is it needed to reach the 2021, the 2 billion doses of vaccine and therapeutics, all the targets. We need 38 billion, so that 18 was hardly enough. And so where we are is we have reached a point where, in fact, the real dollars coming to Accelerator still requires another 28 billion to raise. And you can see that the right-hand side showed you the rollout of the vaccines dealing with really global needs, which are huge. Next slide. So the first thing I want to make is the world has to realize that they have to invest in this. And this investment, if you look at, is trivial compared to relief stimulus packages. The world has spent over 11 billion today, and maybe even more, 11 trillion, pardon me, trillion. I've missed a few circles, zeros to try to stimulate economy. And you know what? What they've done is use a page out of the playbook from 2018 on economic disaster. So it's all about economic recovery. Yes, there's some in health. 38 billion is a spit in the ocean. So where's that money come from? We have to now raise the money from donor countries, etc. That's not sustainable. Next slide. So I would say ACT Accelerator, if you don't know about this, read it up. It's really quite amazing because we have demonstrated that it can be done and that we should sustain it. And we're calling, as you see, G20 leaders and around the world to change the course of COVID-19 to, in fact, invest more. Next slide. So I already talked about, it is a good case study for global coordinated response, multilateralism, solidarity. It's a good case study for financing because how difficult it is in the middle of a war zone trying to raise the money. Next slide. So we are now working on this big issue. We, meaning National Care Medicine, along with Wellcome Trust and G20, to look at how to create a sustainable financing. And I want you to look at the second bullet. The primary source of finance support is development assistance. That's the way we do things today. We need a model where people truly commit to long-term sustainable funding without having to cup in hand or head in hand to get funding. So identify gaps in current funding mechanisms, pragmatic recommendations, and propose long-term solutions. So we are putting together a major economic leadership, including people like Larry Summers, etc., to look at how to create this and to bring it to G20, to ask for a sustainable financing during peacetime, not only wartime. Next slide. The other challenges, as you heard, is that we need to have equitable access. So equity, as Lisa pointed out, is having the opportunity to realize your great potential. And to do so, we need multilateralism, everybody working together for the same purpose. We need a coordination rollout of vaccines, equitable distribution of monoclonal antibodies, treatment, diagnostics, and we need public trust. I'm going to talk about that for the rest of my talk. Next slide. Okay, so if you look at this slide, this is now already outdated. There's over 1.5 million deaths and counting. But you know what's happened is we have observed an issue called vaccine nationalism. Every country is taking care of itself. Well, okay, you say it makes sense because after all, we need to protect our citizens. It only makes sense partially. We need to think about the rest of everybody else. So here, many bilateral deals has made. Do you know that 13% of the world's rich country has cornered more than 50% of all the vaccines? So there's tremendous problem in this. So when we're working on the ACT Accelerator, the vaccine arm is called COVAX. It's a coronavirus vaccine, COVAX. And so this pillar decided to work together, as I talk about, end-to-end solutions. So we say, let's pull all our resources together to solve this problem, from early research to clinical trials to risk manufacturing, guarantee the companies, to allocation, distribution, you name it. So do that. What we said to many countries is that you don't have $11 billion like US, even UK, even Japan, Singapore. Singapore has 5.8 million people. They can't spend $11 billion. So we're able to begin to get many countries coming together, shown in the second bullet, to pool their financial resources to buy vaccines at scale together. And in so doing, make a commitment of so many percent will go to global equity and so many percent immediately for their own people. The usual agreement is about 20% because, as you see later on, the frontline workers, the people at risk, more or less the initial phase one is about 20% of population. And then there's also a lot of different, too difficult to explain, levels of decision. But the whole idea is to have everybody protected, particularly those at the highest risk. Next slide. The good news is we're succeeding. You can see under Gavi, that purchase, advanced purchase agreement, 92 economies, those are poor countries. Under the two self-financing options, there are 100, I guess I'm doing the math, 94 countries, and I think even more now, willing to come in to buy the vaccine under a joint purchasing. They're not prohibited from buying their own vaccine still, but they will join this group to get multilateralism. That's the good news. So you can see we cover now about 7 billion people. So it's really quite amazing that 186 economies with 94 self-financed countries like Singapore, Switzerland, Japan, Norway, UK, and others are all now joining part of this. Next slide. So I think out of Accelerator, we've found a way to work together. Question is sustaining it. The dollars are still not enough. We still need to be able to move forward with a lot more dollars to be able to make sure everyone have access to it. Now, what are the major issues? I'm going to quickly talk about platforms, where we are in clinical trials, regulation, allocation, issuing, and monitoring. Next slide. All of you know this by now. I think this is a great testament to the science that where we are. The world should be very, very proud that we have invested in science and companies have invested in science, and it's come with all these new platforms instead of the good old heat inactivated, life attenuated, inactivated virus or protein subunit, all the way to viral vector, recombinant DNA, RNA platform, and antigen presenting cells. Next slide. And as you know, globally, there are now 200 some vaccine candidates, 11 in phase 2 and 13 in phase 3 as of December the 2nd. And you know many companies, AstraZeneca, PFIZER, BioNTech, Novavax, Moderna, and J&J and others. Next slide. I think what's really exciting in my mind is the data that's come out from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. They have completed the phase 3, and the efficacy now shows that the Pfizer vaccine is 95% effective, beginning 28 days after first dose. And by looking at the number of cases that got COVID, 162 were in the placebo group versus 8 vaccine group. And it was consistent with all age groups, including the elderly. And the safety data has been achieved and approved by DSMB, and there are no major serious concerns. And as you know, they already submitted for FDA for emergency authorization, which we met advisory group on December 10th. So we could have a vaccine very quickly around the corner. Right now, they are having about 50 million doses by 2020, and maybe 1.3 billion by the end of 2021. Just a few days ago, the UK regulatory agency have given them also emergency approval already. So they begin to distribute in UK. So the news is good. However, as you know, the follow-up is quite short, usually 2 months, and safety is only, you know, for 2 months of those who've been followed up. Next slide. Moderna, shortly after that, also come up with preliminary and now final analysis. As you can see, the data is also very impressive, 94%, with severe cases 100%, and 2 months of follow-up and safety. And they also are going to have a hearing on December 17th. Next slide. Now, both these doses have required 2 doses, as you know, about 21 days or 28 days after second dose. AstraZeneca, Oxford, not to be outdone, announced that they did well too. And I think there's a fair amount of, shall we say, people want to know more, you know, through public release. And they did a very interesting announcement saying, you know, one dose regimen in which we gave half a dose followed by a full dose was really great. And that's a small population. And the others show 62. And many of you know, you just don't slice and dice data like this. More importantly, people are wondering whether they made a mistake by giving half dose in this group. Whatever it is, it does show promising, but we are waiting to see what else is going on. But if it does come on, it's not an mRNA vaccine, it's an adenovirus vaccine, and there are some safety issues, but if it's good, it may be even easier because you don't have the cold chain issue, the storage that which you need for mRNA vaccine, which you need minus 70-degree freezers. Next slide. So I just want to show you how impressive it is. And regardless of what you think about the vaccine right now, it is quite amazing that usually it takes 4 to 15 years to get a vaccine. We don't even have one HIV. But here, from 60 days from knowing the sequence to creating vaccine candidates, and then getting right into 10 months from concept to having results in phase 3, and the first time an mRNA vaccine reached clinical application. 15 weeks to finish phase 1, 11 weeks to finish phase 2, 300 days to come to interim analysis. It's unheard of. I would say that we have reason to celebrate how good science is now. Yes, we do need to know this at the end of the day is safe, but I think that these platforms give me great excitement about influenza, which we're now working on. If you imagine that how we do influenza vaccines, we have to know possibly what's trained, we culture it, we make the vaccine, we grow in chicken eggs. Here, just knowing the sequence, as the influenza begins to break, you know the sequence, you can actually begin to look at how to create a vaccine immediately. More timely, more targeted. So I'm quite excited about this, and we're working at National Academy on a committee which is meeting on Monday on this issue. Next slide. Questions. Is it safe? Will people take it? If we have limited doses, as Lisa said, who's going to get it first? And how do we distribute when we have enough doses? And what about the whole global equity and access? Next slide. Okay, so at US, the regulatory framework is under FDA. And FDA, traditionally, the front door is approval and licensure. And you all know what how that bar is set. But under emergencies, such as pandemic and emergency, it is possible to have products which are still called investigational to receive an EUA. So some people use the word approve. I call it authorized. It's not quite the same as approval licensure, but you can do that. And of course, all of you know under compassionate use, you can also use investigative outside clinical trials. So EUA is a real issue here. And I would point out 2 things about EUA. When you have enough data, even interim data that meet DSMB points that says, wow, the data looks really good and safety looks good, you can apply for EUA. Now, the good news at Moderna and Pfizer is that they actually, the whole phase 3 trials follow shortly after. So you're looking at the whole trial, not interim analysis. Second point is it's still considered as investigational, and that eventually these products have to go through approval and licensure, but they are allowed to be used during emergency. Third is, therefore, it doesn't have the surveillance and safety data as good as it should be. So part of the EUA is to create a measurement of how safe it is on an ongoing basis, reporting back. So next slide. At the WHO level, they also have the same mechanism called prequalification and emergency use listing procedure. Basically the same issue. Next slide. And if you look at global, which is part of this talk, the way it's done is that you also submit efficacy, safety, quality data, and suitability. And then it goes through a WHO review of PQ or EUL. Right now it's EUL, but if you look at proper vaccine, it will be pre-qualification, which is same as approval. But it also undergo national and state regulatory agency. For example, in Europe, in China, everywhere else, even FDA, just because WHO say so, they need to work, as you see in the right-hand column, with independent assessment. And the recommendation of these 2 will result in fact, in-country approval. So harmonization of these regulatory agencies is really important. A lot of work to be done. Next slide. So let's finish up by talking about allocation, distribution, monitoring. Next slide. So WHO has a allocation mechanism. They have now shared it. And they look at the same idea as many of us, reducing mortality and protecting health systems. Tier 1 would have frontline workers, people age 65, and those who have under 65 with chronic disease, multi-comorbidity, put them at risk. Next slide. As many of you know, National Academy asked by CDC, NIH in the summer, work on an equitable allocation framework. I think it's very wise for them to do that because CDC committee was not able to come up with recommendation until now. They know what vaccine. So the nation's left at what do we do? What do we do? So we went at great speed over 3 months, come up with this. Next slide. And the key issue is to look at the left side. The principles are important. We think of maximum benefit, equal concern, mitigation of health inequities, fairness, transparency, evidence-based. We went in with this, led by Helene Gayle and Bill Foege, and a great of outstanding committee members, and came up with 4 phases. Phase 1, 1A, jumpstart, healthcare workers, first responder at great risk. They are at great risk themselves. They also have to take care of patients. Phase 1B, people with comorbidities at great risk, severe comorbidities, and older adults, particularly living in nursing homes or long-term facility or crowded settings. Phase 2, teachers, essential workers, high work environment, including, in fact, in jails, prisons, and detentions, homeless shelters, and of course, people at all ages with comorbidity, and of course, whatever elderly that's not covered in phase 1. Phase 3, we begin to broaden it, and phase 4, everyone. And if you look at the bottom, the key point is we look at vulnerability and as the key driver, how to set these phases. Now, we debated a lot about communities of color because we know communities of color are highly vulnerable to this. But at the end of the day, it's not the skin color. It's not, we don't believe it's a biology. It is the social environment which many of these people live in. The fact you live in overcrowded, multi-generation homes, the fact you have to go and take jobs that none of us will do. We're sitting at our Zoom facility. They have to go frontline and work. The fact that they live in really great socioeconomic challenges. So we decided to use CDC's Social Vulnerability Index as the main driver, which obviously coincide with, in fact, communities of color. And in the allocation, it will be done in communities according to this vulnerability index, which in fact, in many ways go into communities of populations that in fact, some are highly concentrated with African Americans, you name it. Next slide. And just 2 days ago, CDC committee finally came out with an interim recommendation, and not different from any of the recommendation we and WHO have done. Essential workers, healthcare providers, long-term care facility residents, and people with high risk with medical conditions. Next slide. So what to expect? As I said, we talk about maybe 40 million doses by December, right now. So if it's given 2 doses per person, you talk about immunizing about 20 million people if you can administrate it quickly. And of course, the numbers start going up in terms of doses as we go into the spring and certainly by summer and by the fall. Here gives you an idea of what the size of the population we're looking at. 20 million healthcare personnel, 53 million 65 and older, 80 million essential workers, 100 million with high risk. So there's going to be some work to do, and you can see the Venn diagram where the Venn diagram overlaps everywhere. That's probably the vicinity about 40 million, 30, 40 million people. So I think we can look forward to probably a lot more demand, hopefully a lot more supply next year. Next slide. Now, CDC has been working really hard. This slide is helpful. If you look at the right side, BARDA, this is the warp speed and getting vaccines ready. And I give credit to US government to actually have BARDA and Active Cellular getting us ready, only for US. And now the fact it's ready, it will be CDC to do the distribution. Many of you know the distribution are done through, as they say, WAPC military and others, to the pandemic vaccine distribution, as you can see in the middle. And in that middle, you see the idea would be to have state jurisdiction, local, to take farther into distribution. So you all heard about the use of McKesson, Walmart, and others. That, as Lisa said, there's a lot of work to be done and still not 100% clear. But the idea would be to give it to local entities to implement according to the allocation and to administer and to therefore get it out to others. So that is the whole idea of the immunization program. Next slide. And of course, safety is a main issue because these are still emergency authorized. So we want to make sure we continue to follow these patients. As you can see, there's a vaccine safety data link at CDC. There's a data safety monitoring system, and healthcare providers report them, but more, they are planning to do a smartphone app to allow patients to follow surveillance, to report back if any symptoms. So that, in fact, is how this is going to be followed. Next slide. In the global, it's even more difficult, as Lisa said. Each country will get their share. They're going to have to decide how to allocate, even though they use the WHO is not mandatory, and even use it, it's not easy to look at how would you look at data to say you belong to this category or that, and how do you distribute them? As I put a quote on the Health Affairs article, in Gavi-eligible countries, our experience show there are in practice two separate, often not well connected supply chains. The segment that move vaccine supplies to receiving country, just like our country, from the federal government to the receiving states and local jurisdiction, and the segment that moves vaccine to the port of entry and to healthcare provider. This is the big one that I believe our country is going to have to grapple with. There's storage I talked about, particularly -70 storage, how to keep it cold. Supply chain, I'll show you data, which is really quite hair-raising globally. Well, WHO is estimating that 50% vaccine may be wasted globally because of temperature control, logistic, shipment issues. And as Lisa said, there's just not enough workforce. Next slide. I just want you to look at a couple of examples. In 2012, pardon me, look H1N1, Nigeria on the first column, 30% had no syringes, and 20% states experienced vaccine stockouts. If you look at the middle column, 20.8 million vaccine doses were lost in 5 countries due to COVID failures, cold chain failures, 41% refrigerators were non-functional, and you can go and on. So you can see this is a big problem. Just because we got vaccine, we think we got everybody covered, we don't. And I think the implementation side that Lisa is saying is so right, but we got to do it fast because it's happening already. We can't have perfection. Next slide. Hesitancy. I think you all know the data on the left side, which shows that 50% of public said they'll take it, 20% they said they never take it, 30% says maybe. The middle is really interesting because when we begin to look at physicians, if you look at the middle column, this is from Israel, let's look at the middle horizontal column. 80% of physicians said they'll give it to they tell the patients to take it. 60% nurses would say they will when vaccine's ready. And if you look at the bottom, which is, would you vaccinate your child? 60% of physicians said they would. That leaves 40% out there, and 55% nurses. Now look at my right-hand column. This is US survey. This is really scary. lot of physicians and nurses are saying they're not going to be the first one to take it. The nursing data is particularly concerned. By the way, immediately after this meeting, I'm hosting a town hall with Robert Redfield, Steve Hahn, and Francis Collins to have all the healthcare provider leadership, 100 or so, to talk to them about this whole issue about healthcare mistrust, healthcare provider and hesitancy, to regain the transparency and to see we can move forward. Next slide. I think if you look at hesitancy, there's anti-vax, we know that, but I think there's a general hesitancy in healthcare, but there are populations who've been exploited over the years, communities of color, Tuskegee, and now because the way that we have talked about it, sometimes politically in Wall Street, etc., people just don't trust the government and don't trust. So that's why it's so important to have transparency, to bring people out there, to make sure that people understand it. Next slide. And nationally, we're doing our share. We have public efforts, including our report, which had 2,500 people participating, over 1,400 written statements. We work with the Black Coalition Against COVID and blackdocs.org. We have webinars on minority communities. We have perspectives on public health community for Native American communities, working with Salute America for bilingual outreach. We're looking at opinion leaders, healthcare religious leaders. I just told you about today's healthcare leaders meeting. We're getting states ready. This is before CDC came ready, and about a dozen states have adopted our allocation in preparation for their allocation, and we're creating a long-term communication. Next slide. Okay, so in summary, I think I've given you a good kind of tour for the whole issue. I think that we need, given our interconnected nature, we need solidarity. Everybody counts. We need multilateralism. And in this vaccine, we need to make sure there's safety, efficacy, and equitable access everywhere. In our report, we say to US, please reserve 10% of your vaccine for global and 10% for surprises. Well, whether you're going to do it or not, I don't know. But we need to think about our neighbors, our friends, everywhere. Thank you very much.
Victor, fantastic. Thank you so much. Incredible. We got a lot of questions in the chat room here. I'm going to try to sort of go through these kind of rapid fire. You have a time limit you have to leave, Victor?
I can do about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Great. Question one. It's been reported good responses from Singapore and South Korea. People, WHO and others rarely mention Taiwan. Is this a political kind of a elimination of the Taiwan data?
I apologize. I did not mention, but you're absolutely right. Taiwan is phenomenal in their response.
Doing great.
And yeah, and I don't know whether it's not mentioned elsewhere political, but certainly in my case, I just overlooked it. You know, I'm giving a talk and I'm thinking about which country do I need?
Oh yeah, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, great, thanks. Okay, next question. As we think about funding and accountability, what are some adaptations needed for fragile and conflict settings where a strong national leadership may not be present?
Yeah, you know, this is so important. I think we've learned the fragile states are particularly vulnerable. And it's not only because of the war or other things, it's because people prey upon the fears of people. So I think in this case, I do believe that WHO and many NGOs play a very important role. As you know, they have been attacked under those circumstances. So UN, WHO play a critically important role to be that normative organization that can come in to help balance the playing field. I think global leaders need to play a critical role, G20, to really not only take a position on this, but also provide resources and whatever's needed to make sure you help those states.
Tough question here. What are your recommendations to sustain the longer term commitment in resiliency in a global as opposed to national level for the next pandemic?
Yeah,
next pandemic.
Yeah, Rob, I said it. I think we really need multilateralism.
Yeah.
It starts off with everybody being in the same boat. And
Yeah.
I think Accelerated demonstrate for the players in the area of vaccine diagnostic, we are now getting multilateralism. We're working together, countries coming together.
Yeah, the slide you showed with all those groups finally working together was really
Yeah.
quite impressive.
Yeah. You know, guess what? US is not part of it. And I can tell you that US, we have worked several times, and US almost came in to join it, but then, you know, because of WHO issue, it did. We're now obviously reactivating this conversation because how can anything happen suddenly in resource and decision in G20, G7 without US leadership?
Yeah.
So we're certainly looking forward to
Well, this could change in January 20th.
you got it.
Yeah. Okay, can you please speak about how intellectual property will or should be handled for some of the vaccine manufacturing and distribution? Some low and middle income countries propose invoking the Doha Declaration from the WHO TRIPS agreement to allow for suspending patent restrictions. Will COVAX support this? If not, then this will slow the speed of the vaccine distribution.
Wow, this is out of my pay grade. He obviously knows a lot more than I do, she or he. But I think liability rather than intellectual property is actually a big part of the COVAX, and liability is addressed. You know, people all need, you know, indemnification. IP, certainly, I don't know, you know, I don't want to say anything that I don't know enough about. I'd love to hear that individual. Maybe he can tell me more about this.
Victor, hi, it's Mark. That was my question.
Oh, no surprise to me, Mark.
Thanks. I'm interested largely about, you know, who's going to be able to manufacture this quickly. And I think there's obviously concerns of the companies that are in the lead that there could be problems with quality and the way in which they're
well, this also comes up, the Chinese and the Russians, two companies
Yes.
in China and the Russians have already contracted out to sell millions and millions of doses at a very, very low cost, older technology. What do you think
Mark,
of that?
I think on the former, I can tell you that in the companies that we're dealing with, which is COVAX and US Warp Speed, they all are doing risk manufacturing. I think most people know what that is, right? That is, you don't even know it's going to work or not, but we're going to start manufacturing.
Right.
That they need financial de-risking, which is what these things are doing. These deals have financial de-risking. So I think the quality is not going to be an issue. They will have to, you know, to get EU.
They'll have a WHO standard.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I don't think, but when you talk about, and of course, you know, when you look at low-income countries, there's a lot of talk about, of course, manufacturing outside those companies. Serum Institute in India is high quality. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
Will the local people do this? That is your question.
Yeah.
Yes.
What needs to be put in place to prevent falsified or substandard vaccines?
Oh my. Did you ask that again, Mark?
No, that's not for Mark. I don't know who it is. That's an anonymous ask.
Well,
I mean, you know, I mean,
it's from Lisa, inspired
Lisa.
by Mark. So
Okay.
second generation.
Hey, this is a bilateral learning, bidirectional learning.
all right.
She's not answering.
You want to?
No, I think I think again, the idea about where do the sensors go into the system, and where do we bring in this idea about accountability? Because this is going to be, we saw this with HIV medication. It's an enormous opportunity for people to make money in the, you know, through really harm. And how do you do this in a way that brings in some of the technology that will allow people, you know, barcodes or other ways to do that, and whether there's equal investment in that.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that surely, you know, WHO, that's the kind of their space. I'm not closely working at that space, but thank you for asking. But, you know, when you talk about this, and Mark, what he said, it continues to discourage me about the human, some aspects of human nature, where they can look at profit over, you know, what's good. It's really disappointing.
Yeah. Two more questions, Victor. That's it. You've sort of talked about this already, but why is it's coming up a couple times? Why is USA not in COVAX, and what is the implication?
Well, I already implied to you, if not, I told you why.
Yeah.
I can tell you, I work with, I don't want to say too much. I would say work with leaders in the White House, in NSC and others, almost there, then it got stopped.
Okay, last question we have. Can you talk about masking efficacy and the mainstream lack of acceptance and understanding, include not only in the United States, but many other countries?
You know, the main issue we're going to have to, we doing a national is doing behavioral studies. We're about to take on a deep behavioral science study
Yeah.
to understand what actually motivates people to do what. I think that at the end, I mean, I can give you lots of speculative, as you know, my individual human rights is political, you name it. I think what we really need to do is understand behavior. I think COVID, along with many other things, highlights the fact that health sciences need to be much broader. Behavioral sciences, social sciences, because the outcome of all this is so dependent on how people behave, how to protect each other, social protection, you name it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on behalf of everyone, really, thank you so much. It was an incredible presentation. I want to thank Lisa Hirschhorn as well, Victor Dzau, for taking their time and expertise and insight. Is an incredible session today. In addition, thank to you and those of you within our global health community who submitted such fantastic posters. The quality of the posters was incredible this year. Our judges are going to be gathering very soon today, actually, to discuss the posters and give out some awards. I want to remind you the Institute for Global Health's First Friday series will return in the new year on January 8th at noon Central Standard Time. And we will be joined at that time by Professor James Druckmann, who's the Payson Weil Professor of Political Science and Faculty Fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern, for a timely discussion on the role of race, religion, and partisanship in misinformation about COVID, a very timely topic. And we invite all of you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, hashtag FSM Global Health, subscribe to our mailing list to receive communication on upcoming events, and to become a member of the Institute. If you're a faculty here, it's a very easy process to become a member. And more information can be found at our website, which is globalhealth.northwestern.edu/members. So this actually concludes our presentation. Thank you again to our speakers and poster presenters, and for all the people that have joined us today. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Victor. It's terrific.